Hello, listeners. Been wondering how you can help the show? Probably not. But here are 5 things you can do. 1. Subscribe. Support the show by clicking the subscription link in the show notes. 2. Review on iTunes, on our website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, or on whatever app you listen to. 3. Donate. When you go to our website, click the cute coffee cup icon, or in the show notes, click the subscription link. 4. Share. Sharing really is caring. Tell your friends and even your enemies to check out the show. 5. Watch. Wait a minute, it's a podcast, not a movie. Actually, it's both. Check the show notes to find out where to watch the documentary. You can also rent it on Prime Video. That's it. Oh, one last thing. Enjoy this episode.
Hello, loyal listeners. My name is Emily Heskey. Spiritualism is alive, and, well, which is ironic because it is a religion that talks to the dead. Today we bring you episode 1 of Voices from Lilydale. Lilydale is the world's largest spiritualist community, located in upstate New York, somewhere between Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and the Canadian border. It's by the water and on an energy vortex. I've been there myself. You should go too. And now, on with the show. Take it away, Dad.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Reverend Ron Skowronski is a sought-after speaker and teacher at Lilydale for over 30 years. By age 18, Ron was immersed in spiritualism, and at 25, he was the youngest ordained spiritualist minister in the National Spiritualist Association of Churches and pastored Plymouth Spiritualist Church in Rochester, New York, from 1980 to 1990. Long noted as an authority on spiritualism, Ron is also a humorist and social activist. In 1991, he became an ordained minister with United Church of Religious Science and teaches Science of Mind. He is dedicated to working for a world that works for everybody. Ron, with his cohort, Ray Taft, also does a great ghost walk at Lilydale, which I've had the privilege of attending a few times. All right, I'm here with Reverend Ron Skowronski. I went with him on a ghost walk last night. It was incredible. Ron, you've done ghost walks at Lilydale for about 6 years with you and your partner, Ray. What was your most memorable walk?
Probably one of the most memorable experiences I've had. We were at the Inspiration Stump, where all of the weekly ghost walks usually end up for a prayer, a meditation, and a reflection. And after it was all said and done, a lady approached me and started to talk to me about the fact that her son, she was interested in communicating with her son. And as I was relating to her, it occurred to me that, I had to, of course, tell her that the purpose of the ghost walk wasn't, just to gain historical and to some extent phenomenal evidence of spiritualism and so forth. And we got to talking about that a little bit. And I suddenly became aware that through my own intuition, through my own intuitive self, that the presence of her son was very much with her. A few moments had passed, I was able to share a couple of my impressions, and what it turned out to be was that the impressions that I did end up sharing, she identified with very powerfully, to the point where she was getting a bit weepy-eyed and in that recognition. And it was just a very moving experience, because it helped her, I think, gain some closure. I think it helped her gain some insight, because all too many people, even in this day and age when we're sending rockets into space and we're doing all kinds of amazing things, all too many people on this planet still believes that when the brain stops, consciousness ends. And I was blessed to be able to give her some insight that proved that theory completely wrong. And that was really quite moving, to the extent that I was also able at that moment, I perceived her son's dog that was with him in the next dimension of life. And that was kind of the, as they say, icing on the cupcake. She said, wow, I never thought I'd actually get my son and his dog.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I went on the walk last night, and just to give people perspective, the first hour and a half or so, we walk around the hamlet of Lilydale. You point out some places of interest. And the last part, we walk down this kind of short path into the woods, and we go to an area where there's a stump, and we sit down and quiet for like about 10 minutes or so, and you say a prayer, and then you ask anybody if they've had any revelations. It was weird. Last night I was looking out in the woods, and I could have sworn I saw like this white light, and I'm thinking, does someone have their camera on? Does someone not listen to you and put their camera off? And I kept looking, and then it was gone. And then I looked again, and then it was there again. It was down by the base of the trees, not high up to the sky. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. I had no idea what it was. I didn't have my glasses on, but it looked like some light glow coming from the trees. And I'd asked you guys about that, you and Ray. What's Ray's last name, by the way?
Taft.
Okay. Yeah, you both had said that is something that has happened there before, where people would see light kind of emanating from the woods sometimes.
It is not uncommon, especially in that environment, to see what we old-timers called spirit lights. And I guess the term that's more used now than any other is spirit orbs. And many times those lights come and go with incredible rapidity. And also, if you're really fortunate, some of the lights actually, people have taken photographs or even digital images on their cell phones. And there's actually been images, if you will, in the orb, images of a person's face. Because these lights or orbs, by and large, represent individual spirit entities that want to be identified, want to be recognized. More often than not, it's done electronically. And, I'm not a photographer, and I don't pretend to be a physicist, but it seems that especially the digital cameras and so forth seem to capture these things more easily and more readily than the naked eye. But indeed, it is also a phenomena that people see with their eyes as well. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I vibrate on a lower level than most people around here. So you're not very observant. But at first I'm thinking, is my mom? And then I thought like Native American. It's weird. I got a sense of like Native American. I don't know. So, all right, excellent. So let's go to, oh, by the way, if anyone does go to Lilydale, I highly recommend it. I've gone a couple times, and you don't cheat people out of their money. We started by 9:15, and I got home at 12:30, and my hotel was right across the street. So it was like
it's not just a walk; it's more of a forced march. We go around the entire hamlet. There's 160 acres here. That's not to imply you walk every inch of that, but you go through predominantly the history, and also what I like to call authentic ghost stories. Especially in this environment, you must trust me. We don't need to make anything up. There's a lot of authentic lore that we share so that people can appreciate some of the experiences others have had, in the hopes that they too may gain some insight by having an experience of their own.
Yeah, you made a point last night. Even though Lilydale sits on an energy vortex, and it's got like 40 plus mediums, or however many live here, that talk to the dead. There aren't a lot of ghosts, really, but there is a lot of communication with spirit. So it's kind of interesting. So there are ghost stories, certainly. We're in the Maplewood Hotel right now. We'll get to that in a little bit. But it's not really like a scary haunted place. I think the scariest thing for me on the ghost walk is always, am I going to trip and fall?
Yeah,
we're outside.
Yeah. It's a little known fact, but there is not 1 square inch of flat land in Lilydale. It's all very undulating, hills and valleys, if you will. That's why we, on the ghost walk, prior to the ghost walk, we give each patron a complimentary mini flashlight. And that's more for self-preservation than it is as a souvenir.
Yeah. No, it's a good move. In the Lilydale Museum, so there's a museum with a lot of great stuff, a collection of the past. There's a binder, and we were in there last night, and a woman said, "Bob, take a look at this. There's a binder," she whispered as you were showing other things.
Right.
And it's a binder of photos that people send in, and they say, "Hey, I was here, and I got home, and I noticed these orbs, or I saw this." Tell us about that book, and are there any favorite photos that you can recall?
It's funny. Invariably, when people come here, sometimes they'll take a cell phone image, or even back in the day, they'll take a photographic image on I'm pretty old school, 35 millimeter camera and whatnot. And when it's developed, they'll get a picture of orbs, or they'll see those, electronically on the cell phone. And people will send things in. I've had people email me images that they've caught, and then also our museum, they send them to the museum, and we try to categorize them to the best of our ability. And most of the time, I know there's a couple in there, the ones that are the spirit lights, the orbs, that you can actually see the images of the faces. The more we can identify an individual, the more we can hopefully identify what that image represents as an individual. Some of the images are quite interesting, and I think one was someone who looked like a Civil War veteran, I think Union soldier, and my only explanation for that was that it looked to me like someone that they had with them, a spirit entity that had come with them to Lilydale. And so those are the kind of things that I remember, because again, it's hopefully more and more evidence for the afterlife that we continue to this very day, try to gather, not just to amaze and amuse, but to, the whole purpose is to help people cope with, let's say, the loss of a loved one, or help them to overcome their own fear of the afterlife. And all of that evidence we gather to those ends, we feel is significant.
Yeah, it's not a thin binder. It's pretty thick. It's a lot of images. And there's a note. There's like a handwritten note usually from people there.
Yep.
That's in it too. It's really cool. All right. So we're sitting right now in the Maplewood, which is the Grand Hotel at Lilydale. It actually kind of began as a stable, and it has a unique architectural history of how it's developed over the years. And also some horse hauntings. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this.
Oh, yeah. Back in 1880, this was built, and the first floor of it began around that time as an actual stable to keep horses. And they began to realize, as this area was being developed, first by what they would be calling themselves the freethinkers, and then subsequently as that evolved into the spiritualists, they began to realize that there were more and more people coming here and they needed to house them. So they used a method of construction that I am still researching. It's called hung, H-U-N-G, construction. And what you do in hung construction is you lift that floor up and you build your second floor underneath that. Then you lift those 2 floors up and your third floor is built underneath that. And finally, you lift that up and your 4th floor is built under there. So it's not like your lobby is your first floor. Your lobby is actually the last, floor. This area here was the last floor that was built. Now, obviously, it's a mode of construction that I would think is very labor intensive, with a lot of pulleys and ropes and horses and all sorts of other things. And when I say 4 floors, I'm speaking strictly of this building. I honestly don't know how far you can take this. Could you build 80 floors? I don't think so, but I don't know for sure. In any event, that's how finally it came down to 4 floors. And so our very top floor really is the first floor. If I were to take you up there, which unfortunately liability issues and 80 lawyers later I can't do, but I've been up there and I can assure you that there are still the vestiges of horse stalls there. So that's a really fascinating aspect of its history. In fact, I can tell you a brief story about that. Many years ago, when I was much younger and a lot less gray in this beard, I took a job here as a desk clerk. One evening, a lady came downstairs and she said, "I have to get out of here." I go, "Why do you have to get out of here?" And she says, "I just can't sleep. The noise is killing me." I said, "Where are you?" She says, "I'm on the 3rd floor," which really for us is the 2nd floor. Okay. And I said, "Are they having a party? Is somebody talking too loud?" She says, "You're never going to believe me." And I said, "Think of where you are and think of who you're talking to. Try me." She says, "I keep hearing horses' hooves." And then it suddenly dawned on me, yes, she could easily be hearing horses' hooves. And all it took was moving her room, which made her happier, much happier. But it was a very intriguing evening because it suddenly dawned on me that we haven't kept horses on this property in generations. But there may be, and maybe I'm going to go out on a limb here and say there are spirit horses that from time to time are still heard in this building.
Here I heard someone call front desk, and I heard the guy answer and said, "Oh yeah, we don't know exactly which room to tell you it's haunted, but it varies on the different. We can't promise anything, but we can tell you like there have been some happenings here." So,
absolutely.
Yeah, and it's I guess it's not floor 1 through 3; it'd be floor 2 through 4. I guess that
right. 2, 3, or 4 is what you would expect, and some people are very protective. They'll tell you about an experience they've had, and you'll ask them, "Well, what floor were you on, or what room did you have?" And they say, "No, I can't tell you that." Why can't you tell me that? Well, because then everybody will want that room. And so they become kind of yearly visitors so that they can have I suppose you could call it, the thrill of that experience. We have an individual here who has been here for a number of years, very honest, very reliable, an absolute pillar, if you will. And we were talking about the true ghost stories of Lilydale. She said, "I've got one." I go ahead. Turns out she was going down the hall with the intention of going to this one specific room to serve it, to clean it. And as she was beginning to open the door, she felt someone or something grab her posterior, grabbed her butt. And she turned around and there was nobody there. So she began to open the door again, and it happened a second time. Well, she spun around and said, "If you do that again, I will never come into this room again, and I will never clean it again." And as far as I'm aware, to this point, the phenomena has ceased. So a Randy ghost we did have, or perhaps still do have, but that's as obnoxious as it's gotten around these parts.
Yeah, put in his place. That's a great story. Also in the Maplewood, we're sitting in the room right now, it boasts something that you talked about on the tour called precipitated paintings, which is a visual form of mediumship that is no longer practiced. But you have some paintings in here, for lack of a better term, I guess, calling them paintings, by the Bangs sisters and the Campbell brothers. So you mind telling us what precipitated paintings are and how you came to acquire these?
During the probably first 50 or 60 years of the spiritualist movement, there was an enormous amount of physical phenomena, and much of it was what you would call objective. In other words, it could be handled, it could be experienced in an objective way. And the Campbell brothers, 2 gentlemen, and also the Bang sisters, experienced this form of mediumship. And what they would do is they would take a blank canvas. It was examined usually by pillars of the community, and in some cases, scientists, doctors, university professors, that type of individual, to ascertain that it was what it purported itself to be, a blank canvas. And during the seance, what would happen is the mediums, in this case, either the Bang sisters or the Campbell brothers, would usually sit on either side of the portraiture. And what would happen during that seance was the portrait of the spirit entity that wanted to be identified would precipitate or basically develop on that canvas. And the only visual I can plant in anyone's mind about that probably looked very much like a Polaroid photograph being developed. But at the end of the process, you would see what looks very much like a really well done oil painting. The interesting thing, though, is that these have been analyzed by different organizations who specialize in color and photography and painting and so forth. And to the best of my education, the vast majority of them, when they're not using my favorite word to describe psychic phenomena or UFOs for that matter, inconclusive, when they're not using that term, they began, the analysis was these pictures do not have what we call traditional brush strokes. We can't really understand what this material is, but it's not like any kind of paint we've ever seen. And a lot of these were done during that first cycle of the spiritualist movement. And so, for example, in here we have a 60-inch by 80-inch portrait of Azur, A-Z-U-R, and he is a spirit guide, was a spirit guide for the Campbell brothers, and he is referred to as Azur the Helper. We have Leolyn Pettingill, the granddaughter of one of the very, very prominent early spiritualists, Abigail Pettingill. And she was the first granddaughter to Abigail, and she passed away very young, I think at 14. And that was done through the Bang sisters. We've acquired them over the years because they were done here, and as a result, many of them were donated to Lilydale. Now, if you go to a place like Chesterfield, Indiana, a place called, of all things, Camp Chesterfield, which again has its underpinnings in the late 1800s, that became a very prominent for the development of spirit precipitation portraiture. In fact, they have a little, I shouldn't say little, it's actually fairly large, a museum there which predominantly houses the work of the Bang sisters. So obviously, at least in my mind, they collected a lot more of their work than we did, and therefore needed to build housing so that people could appreciate it. It's a very fascinating phenomena. I'm a very straightforward individual. I've seen some of this kind of stuff that is nothing more than pure, unadulterated fraud. But I go by my own experience. In order for there to be a counterfeit, there must have been at least one original. What I've come to find out is that the work of the Bang sisters and the Campbell brothers was just extraordinary. People have continued in different, I think, parts of the country, probably very much so in Camp Chesterfield and in other parts of the world, to try to duplicate this form of mediumship. And I don't really know how successful they've really been to date, but I do know that this work here it's the zenith of that kind of phenomena, at least at that time in history. So it is, in my opinion, worth investigating, and to that end is very thought-provoking.
Yeah, you mentioned Polaroid. I think the gold standard for paranormal investigators, they love Polaroid cameras. There's a type of film, I think it was called Spectra film, that you don't make it anymore.
No.
They can't find it anywhere. And that was the one people would have the best results with. Yeah?
Spectra was a product made by Polaroid, I believe. I could have that wrong, but I don't think so.
I think it was, yeah.
And just like people who work with this phenomenon with EVP, recording spirit voices and so forth, their gold standard happened to be this old Panasonic handheld mini tape recorder that isn't made anymore.
Yeah, which is very expensive if you can find one.
It's like now they're worth their weight in gold because
Thousands.
for some reason the technology was just right. Again, I wish they'd reproduce that recorder, but I don't always get everything I want, so what can I tell you?
Yeah, one of my sometimes co-hosts is an actor named Kyle Carvin, and on his spare time when he's not in films, he goes and he searches for stuff to resell. And I tell him, if you ever find any Spectra film, let me know.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd love to grab some. One of the gentlemen that's been on the show, his name is Jeff Belanger. He's an author, and he's actually been the research for every single episode of Ghost Adventures, with Zach Baggins and stuff. So he's the guy that goes out and explores and researches all of those shows. And Jeff likes to say, ghosts are history. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, unfortunately, there is, like with, I suppose, many controversial subjects, there is more misinformation or misunderstanding than there is authentic information, and I'll call it reality. I have to say that one of the biggest misinformations is that anytime anybody experiences what we call a materialization or a phantom or a specter or a ghost and so forth, people automatically assume that the as they say, the joint is haunted. And that's not true. More often than not, what happens is because everything, regardless of what it might be, is energy. And so more often than not, what we experience as, quote, a haunting, where people see spirit entities and they can actually see the outline of the individual and perhaps even hear noises or voices and so forth. That could be what I call a psychic signature. It would be like an endless loop. It's a tape recording of energy, and it plays again and again and again, and people go there to that spot. They put their emotional focus and energy there as well. So that's like bringing a new battery into the mix.
A similar phrase I've heard is residual energy.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And it's not that it's a phenomena that shouldn't be investigated and appreciated, but you can't make every single, in quotation marks, psychic phenomena a communication between the spirit's world and you. Some of the time it's just I call myself a conscientious observer. I go into a situation and I might see something, and then later, upon reflection, I'd say, yeah, that energy was because of what happened there was what I was experiencing. And because it's so subjective, it may feel, quote, real. And it is real to the extent that, we get into a TV program or a movie and we're there. We get tied into the emotion of it. But in reality, to make the assumption that perhaps a singular soul is going to be earthbound for, 500 years or so forth, that's pretty harsh. I don't want to particularly believe that that's going to happen to a single individual. So I have to subscribe to the notion of that there's a lot of energy out there that people perceive, but let's be realistic and more cautious before we just accept every little thing, as a direct communication from the spirit world.
Yeah, I think he kind of agrees with that too. I think his point was that rather than being intelligent beings, historic, it's a history, it's an imprint from the past.
It's like a picture or a movie or a tape recording. And it's interesting. I've talked to people who do some of the research on this, that in some places over a period of time, people experience them less and less and less. Well, that's because that energy is, found a way to dissipate. I like to believe that relatively quickly after that person maybe made their transition or passed away in that environment, that they've gone into the light and into their eternality rather than, like I said, being stuck there in an endless loop. So
this is located on an energy vortex. Are there any portals here, or are you believers in portals? Because where I come from in Massachusetts, there's a haunted house right down the street called the S.K. Pierce Victorian Mansion, and a lot of mediums go in there, and they think there are like 3 portals built with that houses where spirits come and pass frequently. There are resident ghosts that are there all the time, but there are a lot of transient spirits as well. Have you heard of any portals that are in?
To be honest with you, in my experience, which has been a good number of years here, no. I'm not that familiar with what would be called portals. To me, describing a portal is like asking somebody to describe what exactly happens in a black hole. Yeah. There's a lot of theories and a lot of romanticized ideas and some of them make great Hollywood fodder. But in reality, I think it was the philosopher Rudolf Steiner who said, we are in a sea of the dead, meaning that the interdimensional interconnectedness, this room could easily be filled with a ridiculously large amount of spirit entities. But because we experience our reality in what I'll call 3 dimensions and occasionally punch through into a 4th, it's thank goodness for that. Because if you were like, and there have been people like this, what I call unbridled psychics or unbridled mediums, where they're just like a supercomputer that's, absorbing hundreds of bits of information almost simultaneously. And that can be very, very disconcerting without the proper controls. So no, I can't say I've experienced any portals. There are spots here that I find are more conducive than others. One of those spots is our auditorium. The other spot is what we talked about, Inspiration Stump, what I like to call the Cathedral of the Pines, because actually that's, if anybody ever goes there and sits there on one of the park benches and just is by themselves, they have a sense of almost like being in a, I'll use the turn of phrase, a medieval chapel. It has a very, not a heavy, but a very quiet, very peaceful vibration, and energy flow. And because thousands and thousands and thousands of spirit messages have been given in that environment, that energy tends to be constantly refreshed, and that's why I think it feels more conducive to the phenomena than, let's say, the cafeteria.
Yeah.
So I want to share some reviews I've gotten from people. First, MB Hannah. She gave me a 5-star review and wrote, "Loeb for president." That was based on our recent second interview with Avi Loeb, and she wrote, "As usual, Heskey finds the most intriguing guest and uses his everyman style to get them comfortable in talking. Loeb is wicked smart, down to earth, and ready to lead the scientific world into a place of leadership by preaching research over war, innovation over condemnation, and active thinking over politics as usual. Love this podcast." And then Rob Fitz gave me a 5-star review, and he wrote, "Interesting listen. Love the subject matter, and it's really well presented." Hannah Faust wrote, "Perfect for road trips and commutes. I love the Afraid of Nothing podcast and look forward to each episode. Recently drove several hours and took Robert along for the ride. Solid content." Frank Grace wrote, "Fascinating. Robert covers a wide range of topics, and this podcast is an excellent companion to his documentary Afraid of Nothing." And then a person called A Substitute, probably not their name, wrote, "Interesting. Have heard Bob on Paranormal Podcast. I started listening. Little Frog sold it. Keep up the good work." And then Shelley Krupski wrote, "Excellent podcast. I recently discovered this podcast when the host was a guest on another podcast I listened to. I've been binging the episodes ever since. I am absolutely loving it. I listen to a wide variety of podcasts and have been checked out quite a few on the paranormal. This one is very well done. The guests are solid and interesting, and I've even taken notes from some episodes. I love how the podcast moves right along with consistent, interesting information. There's never a dull moment. I don't write reviews for every podcast I listen to, but I felt compelled with this one because I love it so much already. Thank you, everyone, for your kind, rock-solid 5-star reviews. Please do go to the website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, and leave your review in the review section, and I'll give you a shout-out and read it out loud."
I was going to ask you the next question, what your 3 favorite spots in Lilydale are. I wonder if the auditorium and Inspiration Stump are 2 of those. What are your favorite places?
My first favorite place, of course, is Inspiration Stump, primarily because, again, it's an outdoor energy chapel as far as I can, use to describe it. You have to go down a path through an old growth forest, probably about 950 yards, nothing ridiculously long. Any reasonably healthy person can just go, it's a gravel path into this clearing that has a couple of dozen of, very sturdy park benches cemented into the ground. The stump itself, which many years ago served as the platform that many mediums have stood upon to deliver spirit greetings. So that's a favorite spot. My second spot, of course, is the auditorium, because that is where so many lectures have been given and so many spirit greetings have been given in order to prove the continuity of life, to comfort the bereaved, to give people a more noble view of their relationship to the universe, or to God, if you will. But also because it's also been a platform through which spiritualism as a religion, as a philosophy, and as a science have been tied into the fabric of social justice and humanitarian causes. Susan B. Anthony spoke from our rostrum at least 6 times before she passed away. Been other great orators, people who have stood strongly against slavery, for example, and against so many of the injustices that have occurred through history, especially during the history of the movement, which is from modern movement from 1848 to the present. From a historical point of view, that really warms my heart and encourages me for the future. And lastly, of all places, is our pet cemetery. We have a pet cemetery that's probably, I don't want to call it the oldest in the country because I don't know that for a fact, but it is surely one of the oldest. And we have your normal cast of characters, dogs and probably a few cats and gerbils and whatnot. But we also have a couple of horses buried there. And one of the horses was a plow horse that was used to take her cart all around Lilydale to collect trash and to deliver supplies and things. And one day they took her out on the lake during the time when they were sawing ice to put in people's ice boxes. And the horse was too heavy with the equipment that was laden upon her, and the ice was thin. She broke through the ice and went to the bottom of the lake. And I will tell you, I learned the meaning of unconditional love when I heard this story, because they found a way to, they could build this building that we're in now with hung construction. They can do anything. But they got that horse from the bottom of the lake and very lovingly and I'm sure ritually buried that horse in our pet cemetery. And because, again, traditionally, spiritualists have always believed that love is the universal bond that binds us together, not only as human beings, but it also binds us to those four-legged friends. And so I can't tell you how many times I've heard mediums bring through, and the folks who are recipients of these messages can identify the souls or the spirits, if you will, a beloved pet. And so with this horse in the pet cemetery, I always tell people, if you're an animal lover, or even if you're just a history lover, visit the pet cemetery. It'll give you a lump in the throat.
Yeah. Did that horse have a name? Do you remember?
I think her name was Molly, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
You know, by the way, I think there's a fourth place that is very near and dear to your heart as well. It's a library, right?
No doubt. The Marion Skidmore Library, which is on Cottage Row here in Lilydale, it contains an enormous amount of textbooks and history books about the science of spiritualism, some of the phenomena of spiritualism, but it also has a lot of modern books relative to spiritualism, metaphysics, new thought, a variety of all those interrelated subjects. And it also houses my beautiful wife, Cecla, who has been functioning as the greeter and, I guess, librarian there for about 21 years. There's a video that she shows. It's a 45-minute video that has some of the folks that have left this world that were integral in modern day, more contemporary expression here. It amazes me, but people who've never seen the video, some of them actually have tears in their eyes after they've seen it, because for some reason it hits them pretty hard in terms of the history, in terms of the focus. There's a lot more to spiritualism than, what I call the sum of its parts. There is a truly transcendental aspect to it that if you study it, in a spiritual, religious context, it will be amazing, because so many things that are coming down the pike now that are being touted as being new or new and improved, the spiritualists were already yawning and saying, that's nice, let's move on to the next truth that we can discover and the next revelation and the next inspiration.
Well, I love the library because my mom was a librarian and for many years, and my kids are just avid book readers. Anywhere we go, they would rather go to the library before even going to the lake or anything like that. They love books, so yeah. In fact, they read so much, their eyes are going. And there you go. Time to get to the optometrist. Yeah, definitely. Last question.
Sure.
So what drew you to spiritualism, and how would you define it?
My circumstances were, I want to say, on one hand, kind of unique, and yet on the other hand, not so much. I started very, very young. I started taking an interest in the psychic phenomena probably at the age of 12 or 13. And by the time I was 17, I had really been pretty sure that I wanted to become a Roman Catholic priest. However, with that interest in psychic phenomena, I discovered there was such a thing called a spiritualist church. And I said, I didn't know what that was. I heard this story about Catherine and Margaretta Fox. In 1848, they experienced this phenomena which started this modern American homegrown religious movement. And once I attended the church and began to see, I experienced some of its mental phenomena, the clairvoyance and such. That was, of course, interesting and very thought-provoking. However, what was really my underlying interest was being a student of not just history, but belief systems, theology, philosophy. I began to realize that this had a wealth, an enormous wealth of spiritual insight and transcendental insight. And so I would say that my best definition is that spiritualism is a religion because it strives to understand what we've always striven to understand. What is God? And what is our relationship to God? And subsequently, the questions that lead us to that most important question are like Job in the Old Testament asked, if a man die, does he live again? And we get glimmers and insights into the afterlife in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and so much other sacred literature throughout the world, whether it's, pick a religion, any religion, there is some kind of an emphasis on striving to answer this question. And of course, the science of it, if you don't want to look at it from a religious or spiritual point of view, or even any kind of a philosophical point of view, you can look at it strictly as, what about this thing called energy? Was Einstein right? Is E equal mc squared? And now, of course, that's evolved into quantum physics to the point where now they've even said there is something that they're postulating called the God particle within the human being. So those are the things that have enticed, stimulated, and so forth. And yet, ironically, as I've grown in that, I've also branched out to recognize that there are so many other faith traditions, but the one thing that transcends, I would say, most of the orthodoxy that I've come in contact with is one of the Declaration of Principles. And if you go to any spiritualist church, you'll open the inside front cover of their hymnal, and there are 9 declarations that are not considered dogmatic or creedalistic, but are the foundational values and philosophical underpinnings of the movement. And one of them is, the door to reformation is never closed against any soul here or hereafter. And so that means we are eternally progressing. We are eternally growing. We are given every opportunity to, as we change our consciousness, to change our life, whether it be this life or the greater life that is to come. And to kind of put again, what I call icing on that cupcake, it proves to me what much of my studies have led me to, that God is love, and those who choose to love truly know God. And so what is love? It's not with condition. It's not with judgment. It's not with fire, brimstone, and punishment. And there is always a second chance, always an opportunity to grow and progress. And those are the things that I try to, in a variety of venues that I serve and in the roles that I play, not only in the Spiritualist church, but in many other churches that I'm involved with over the years. That is so important, because there's a lot of people out there who feel just guilty and ashamed for being alive. And this movement came out very early, very young, through the pronouncements of those the world called dead, and said, enough. Enough of this pain, suffering, and guilt, and shame, and blame. You are part of the all that is. You are part of this thing that we call infinite intelligence, and that this infinite intelligence is also infinitely loving, and therefore you, as being its expression, have the obligation and the right to grow and progress eternally. And it goes down to where it says in Christian scripture, if one of us is raised, we are all raised. And yet if one of us is diminished, we are all diminished. So we have come to the conclusion that in the final analysis, if you can use that turn of phrase, spoiler alert, we all make it. We don't all make it at the same place, so to speak, or the same time, if you want to use those, descriptives. But we are all part of the whole, and we are, again, called to grow. You can choose not to, but it's a short choice, because eventually we all come back to the oneness.
So a couple of questions come out of that. I know it was my last question, and I promise I'll wrap it up on this. But
That's right.
three things came into mind as you were talking. One is spiritualism rooted in America? Did it have its birth here, or was it before that? The second question is, it sounds like, there's a heaven, but there really isn't a hell. Is there a belief in hell or a dark side in the afterlife? And I'm sorry, I'm going to throw a third one at you too. Reincarnation,
Right.
is a big sticking point. I'm sure some people that are spiritualists believe in it, and some don't. That's probably the one area there where there's kind of some debate on. I know I threw a lot at you there, but that's kind of raised the question.
I tell you very frankly, spiritualism has always been called, at least, and I concur with this, an American homegrown religion. I think that there's always been, obviously, mediumship and groups of people who have gathered around this phenomena and built, call them belief systems or religious expression. However, in the context of an organized religious tradition that enjoys its official underpinning as 1848, March 31st, 1848, to the present time, it is definitely American in that sense. And then, of course, that was kind of the proverbial, I call it the shot heard around the world, because that shockwave of that particular phenomena, it seemed that it was the perfect storm where everything fell into place energetically and historically and all that, so that we see the growth and development of a worldwide spiritualist movement. Back in regard to the notion of, is there a hell? You hear people say this all the time. They say, yup, absolutely, and we're sitting in it. One of the principles of spiritualism, man makes his own happiness or unhappiness as he obeys or disobeys nature's physical and spiritual laws, so that people sometimes view this wonderful world we live upon as either a great universal classroom, schoolroom, or the universe's largest insane asylum. We create our reality as far as eternal perdition, eternal punishment for not believing a certain dogmatic idea or engaging in whatever, perhaps a negative or even a heinous behavior. we still come back to what I spoke of earlier, the concept of reformation, to be reformed, to reintegrate into your true nature, your true sense of being. People say, I'm a body that has a soul. The truth is you are a soul, an individualization of the all that is, who is expressing itself through a physical form or a body. And that all of this that we're going through is a learning, it's a growth, it's an evolution. And so the spiritualists have never accepted the notion of, again, eternal punishment. We reward ourselves and punish ourselves by virtue of living in accordance with the natural laws, spiritual laws of the universe. And one of those spiritual laws is very simple. You know, what you sow, you do reap. And that's in thought, word, and deed. And so when you figure out that when you think negatively or you think selfishly, etc., you get a certain result, and you figure out that if you keep doing it, the true definition of insanity is that you keep doing the same behavior, the same thought patterns, and get the same terrible results. You realize that if you change your thinking and think in a more divine or in a more spiritual manner, you will begin to experience life in its abundance, in its fullness. And lastly, this notion of reincarnation. I've spent the better part of, in one way or another, studying all of this kind of thing for 45 some years. And I must tell you that I've been able to argue both points pretty convincingly. I know that, for example, the association that I was once affiliated with, the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, that had its beginnings in 1893 to the present time, did not teach and does not teach reincarnation as a fact. It does teach spiritual communion or spirit return as a fact, so that you can teach it as a theory, a concept, etc. And you find that historically there have been spiritualists like D.D. Hume, I think it's Hume, who said reincarnation is a mansion built on shifting sand. I have met 18 Queen Victorias, 24 Julius Caesars. And it's very true. In the West, we have a really skewed interpretation of karma and what all that and reincarnation, whereas in countries like India and the Hindus, it's more organic and it's not something they give a lot of thought to, but it's still part of their conceptual belief. And I've reached one very interesting conclusion. I now am ordained through the Centers for Spiritual Living as a religious science minister, and one of our ministers one time, a lady by the name of Dr. Terry Cole Whitaker, was asked, does she believe in reincarnation? And she said, you know, there are times I think I do, and there are times I think I don't. But I can tell you this is the life I've been dying to live.
That's great.
And I think if we took that holistic approach and said, look, if the concept of re-embodiment is even valid, our purpose is, again, progress, evolution. So not to worry about what you might have been and become enamored with that and even in some cases obsessed, but you are now at the zenith of your growth and development, and your obligation is to continue that growth and development. Now, the one last thing I will say about that is there are people, medical doctors, psychiatrists, people who've done some research, and some have come to accept the notion of reincarnation and have done some interesting, very thought-provoking work on working with regression as a therapeutic tool for healing body and mind. I do not have a medical degree or, I'm obviously not a psychiatrist, so I can't speak to that other than I obviously am going to encourage that kind of thinking to see where it leads us. So we're still very much, and so can you be a spiritualist and not believe in reincarnation? Without a doubt. And can you be a spiritualist and believe in reincarnation? Without a doubt. I guess in the final analysis, your guess is as good as mine.
Well, that's a great place to end it. And Ron, thank you so much for your time, for the great ghost walk last night, and for your time today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared. Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.